In the last lesson, what we did was talk about the nature of God. We talked about the concept of the idea that God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, with the idea that he is both immanent in the people's lives as well as transcendent above everybody else. In this lesson, what we're going to do is continue to talk about different Christian doctrines and theological beliefs, arguably the second most important of which being the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. So, I say here that this is one of the most important doctrines in Christianity. Apart from the idea that God is monotheistic in nature, this is probably the most important of the doctrines within Christianity. And it does almost set Christianity apart from the other Abrahamic religions in a certain way. The other Abrahamic religions obviously accept the monotheistic concept of God being a single entity, the idea that God is a one person, for example. This is the case in all of the Abrahamic religions, so for example Islam and Judaism. But the doctrine of the Holy Trinity is something that is unique to Christianity, and so it's important that we talk about the doctrine of the Holy Trinity in more detail. So, what is the Holy Trinity? Well, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity tells us that we can represent God not necessarily as an individual person, but as three persons. Now, you might think that this is sort of contradictory to the concept of monotheism, isn't it? The case that Christianity is therefore polytheistic. No, this is not the case. In reality, God is one person, but is represented as three. So we represent God as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And they all show themselves through revelation, through biblical interpretation, in different ways. And we'll talk about a couple of biblical interpretations later on in this lesson. So, what is the Holy Trinity? What is the nature of the Holy Trinity? And how can we examine some of the biblical support for the Holy Trinity? That is the purpose of this lesson. So, most Christian practices suggest that the Bible describes the nature of God as one of the Holy Trinity. Each of these persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, is simultaneously three distinct entities, but at the same time is a single unified God. This is why we wouldn't accept the interpretation, for example, that God is polytheistic. There is a polytheistic religion in the sense of Christianity, because while we represent God as three distinct persons, they are still all the same God. They are still all one person at the same time. It's sort of contradictory in terms of how our modern conceptions of these ideas relate to it, but in reality it does work, at least in terms of the ways in which we can interpret it from a theological perspective. Each of these entities are equal in their power and their value, and they have a perfect and complete relationship with each other. They all serve a different role as well within the Christian doctrine. They all have different purposes for their existence. So, of course, for the most part, the Father is defined as God. When we talk colloquially and when we talk about God within the Bible, we tend to be focusing on the idea of the Father, the concept of God, as we can see in this picture above the Michelangelo's representation. The Son, however, is represented not as God, but as Jesus. And we see Jesus coming down to earth in the New Testament and then sacrificing himself for the sins of man. And so we'll talk about Jesus being very, very key and very pivotal in the doctrines of Christianity, of course. So we know Jesus is the prophet who is said to have come to earth and die for the sins of man. And both the Father, and the Holy Spirit are unseen, and this is contrasted with the Son who came to earth around 2,000 years ago. What is interesting is that for the most part, theologians and historians agree that there did exist some individual who we would describe as Jesus. There is enough historical evidence and interpretation that suggests that Jesus did actually exist as an individual. And the subject of the study of that particular type of Jesus is known as the historical Jesus. It is controversial in some senses, since there are very few sources pointing to Jesus' existence outside of the biblical texts. However, there are some sources that exist outside the biblical texts, and therefore we would come to the conclusion that for the most part we would agree that Jesus did exist as an individual person. Now, whether or not we can then ascribe all of the beliefs that people have about Jesus to this historical Jesus, that's a little bit more controversial. But the idea, at least in the very earliest of senses, that Jesus exists as a historical entity, it is supported at least by the majority of historians. Let's focus on the Holy Trinity then. Let's focus on the interpretations of the Holy Trinity. Well, for some Christian denominations, there is the belief in the concept of the Holy Trinity as fundamentally inconsistent with the idea of monotheism. Essentially speaking, that if we are to describe God as three distinct entities, then surely we are describing three distinct types of God. We are describing, or even describing, three distinct gods themselves. So how can this be consistent with our belief in Christianity being monotheistic? So for some Christian denominations, we either reject monotheism and suggest that Christianity is polytheistic and accept the Holy Trinity, or we reject the Holy Trinity. So if the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit are all distinct entities, but are all God, how can there only be one God? There are some Christian denominations that do reject the idea of the Holy Trinity. So, for example, Christadelphians are a very small minority in terms of Christian denominations that would reject the concept and the belief in the Holy Trinity. Those denominations that do reject the concept of the Holy Trinity are called Unitarians. The idea that there is not a distinct entities that exist in a sort of Trinitarian belief, the concept of the Trinity, but rather there is a unitary belief in the God, that there is a monotheistic belief that in a unitary concept of God, not as a Trinitarian belief in three distinct entities. Let's just talk a little bit about the basic interpretation. So we've got a quote here from the Bible, from John 14, chapter 14, verse 16, 17. It says, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him. But you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. Now, this is a reference to both the Father as part of the Trinitarian concept and also the Holy Spirit in the belief of the Spirit of truth. Now, in terms of biblical references, there is not an equal amount of biblical references for each of the three distinct entities of the Trinity. So the Father and the Son, for example, get a lot more airtime in the Bible than that of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is referenced a lot in maybe in some Old Testament passages. So, for example, in Genesis and in other passages here, like this one in John chapter 14. But for the most part, there's a lot of reference, of course, to the Father, to God, and of course, within the Gospels, there is a lot of reference to Jesus. So we can obviously say that the equal weight of the three entities of the Trinity are not necessarily weighted in favor of the existence of the Holy Spirit necessarily in the Bible. So that's just a very quick recap of the amount in which we see each of these entities of the Trinity within the Bible and biblical texts.